I get a lot of questions about designating units, and this is kind of, as we talked about earlier, this to me is one of the most important topics that we're going to discuss today, and we're going to look at some examples in a minute as to why it's so important. But unfortunately, we don't have great guidance on how, when, or where we're going to designate the units. I'm of the opinion the code says the taxpayer designates the units. So I think that the responsibility number one lies with the taxpayer. That's fairly obvious. Number two, it doesn't say irrevocably designates the units or permanently designates the units. So again, I'm of the mindset that they probably get to float. I want to talk a second about how I think that this designation should work in the industry. So if we kind of think about the hierarchy here of who we would designate units to, we start with the IRS, we have the state agency, and then we have kind of the taxpayer. So I'm of the opinion that the IRS, all they're going to want from us is a checked 8609 that says I've elected income averaging. I do not think the IRS wants to monitor, but in any way, shape, or form, the designation of our units. Could you imagine if you're a mixed income project, every time you had to change a designation due to the next available unit rule that we're going to talk about later, that you have to notify the IRS of this? How do we do that? How would the IRS even process that? So I really don't think the IRS is going to be too interested in how we designate the units as long as we check that box that says we've designated the units and we can fill out our 8609 Part A's every year with our tax returns that says we are in compliance. To me, that's where the IRS is going to stop on the unit designation. Now we get to the state agencies. Obviously, the state agencies are going to be a lot more interested in our unit designations because they're the ones who are going to be monitoring our project. Every year, your project's going to submit to the state agency some sort of project status report, owner occupancy certification, whatever you call it in your state. You're submitting a report to them every year that says you're in compliance, and typically you're listing all the units. I would like the state agency to be, that's how we designate to them on an annual basis what our designations are. If they can look at that project status report, add up those designations, divide by the number of units, as long as that number is 60% or less, then I think we're okay with the state agencies. But I feel like state agencies, this is new, and state agencies, they want to make sure they're setting you up for success. So they are a little bit worried about just letting this be the Wild West of designation and letting people just do whatever they want. And I understand that point of view from a state agency. So I think state agencies are thinking, man, we really got to get this in our regulatory agreement. We need to have these designated in our regulatory agreement so we all know what's going to happen. And I would caution state agencies against swinging the pendulum quite that far, because once it's in your regulatory agreement, if we need to change a designation for various reasons, maybe the market has shifted, maybe we're having a hard time renting 80% units, maybe there's not a big market for 30% units, there's various reasons why we could have issues that we'd want to kind of right size the project and maybe shift some of the unit designations. If that's in our LoRa, that is locked in, and we'd have to either ignore the regulatory agreement, which I'm not a huge fan of, or amend the regulatory agreement, which I'm probably even less of a fan of. And so locking these in the regulatory agreement, I think, is kind of not great policy. Now, I understand as a state agency, if you say, hey, in order to get 9% credits, you have to have 10% of your units at 30, or you do certain things to get points, those items should be in your regulatory agreement, right? They've always been in our regulatory agreement. Those will always need to be enforced and enforceable, so therefore they need to be in the regulatory agreement. But I would say what we'd do there is we'd say, these units you got points for, so 10% at 30. The remainder of your units shall be so designated by the taxpayer so that they have an average affordability of 60% or less.